All right, so we're talking about the cell membrane here today. So what is the cell membrane again? Somebody just said it. Justice, did you tell me?
Yes, ma'am. It's the wall around the cell, the membrane around the cell.
Right. The cell membrane is the it's like the barrier. Okay, the body of the cell, or the barrier that's going to separate the outside of the cell from it's going to separate the internal compartments of the cell from the external environment. Okay, why do you think the cell membrane is so important? Okay, when we just take into account all of the things that we've talked about as far as, you know, what the cell needs and, you know, carrying out the different processes and chemical reactions. What's the role of the cell membrane? Someone.
Kind of just holds everything together and in place.
Holds everything in place? Okay, sure, it sure does. It definitely provides that
It allows
support. Go ahead, Tori.
It allows certain things to come in and out of the cell.
Absolutely. So in your notes right now, that's one of the most important functions of the cell membrane, is it acts as that barrier, right? If you think about it kind of like your skin, it's a layer of protection. It's protecting your body from the external environment. So the cell membrane acts as a barrier to regulate entry and exit of substances. Okay, so we're going to look at this again today in some great detail. The structure of this membrane, what it's made out of, and what is its function. It's a very critical part of the cell. Okay, again, if you just think about your skin is a very important barrier between your body, your internal body, and the outside. Okay, the cell membrane does a lot of things that are very critical, so we're going to look at that today. Two things we want to look at: the structure of the cell membrane and its function. Okay, there are a few learning objectives that I would like you to jot down real quick. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Okay, so the first thing that we want to be able to do today is to evaluate the importance of membranes to the cell. Why is this structure so important? It's super important when we think about, again, maintaining the integrity of the cell. Okay, regulating what's going in and what's going out. Why is that important? It's very important when we think about factors like trying to maintain homeostasis, right? We talked about homeostasis a little bit. All right, the cell membrane plays a large role in that. Making sure the cell can get what it needs. Things can flow into and out of the cell, nutrients coming in, waste going out. All right, second thing we want to be able to do today is to describe the composition of the biological membranes. Okay, so this cell membrane can sometimes be referred to as a biological membrane, okay, because we're talking about the cell in the context of living things. So biological membranes. Composition, that just means what is it made up of, okay? What is the structure of this cell membrane? Okay, we're going to talk about that phospholipid bilayer. And then lastly, today we'll talk about some of the functions, all right, of these membrane proteins. Okay, when we talk about composition, we're going to look at the fact that the cell is mostly made up of proteins and lipids. All right, we're going to look at some of the functions of these membrane proteins. All right, and this lecture is being recorded. I will post it in Blackboard when we're done in our slides. All right, so biological membranes. I kind of already gave you this introduction that cells must maintain an appropriate internal environment in order to carry out the chemical processes that are required for life. So we've talked about this in great detail already, about the importance of maintaining that stable equilibrium, because the cell has a lot of work to do, right? There's a lot of jobs, a lot of processes, chemical reactions and so forth that take place in the cell. And so that cell needs to maintain a nice stable environment, all right? And so first thing that you're writing down on your notes is that every cell is going to be surrounded by this plasma membrane. Every single cell type has a plasma membrane, okay? Now, when we get into the next unit, we'll look at some of the different structures amongst cells, like some of the differences between like the plant cell and animal cell, and structures that may be present on one but not present on the other, like the cell wall. Right, that's something that's present on plant cells, but you don't find that on animal cells. But this plasma membrane here, make sure we're clear. that every single cell has a plasma membrane, okay? And its first most important role is to separate the cell from its external environment. All right. And then next, this plasma membrane has another job, which we talked about already a little bit, which is to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. Okay. And so again, if you want to think about just the whole organism, you, for example, we have mechanisms in place to regulate what comes in and goes out of our bodies. We need things to go in, but we also need things to go out. Okay. That same idea holds true for the cell, and the plasma membrane serves as the point of entry for the entry and exit of substances or materials into the cell. Right? What questions do we have about that? All right, so we know why the cell membrane is important. All right, so what is it made up of? Biological membranes are very complex structures that are made of mostly lipids and protein molecules. Okay, these are two of our major classes of macromolecules that we explored in our last chapter. Okay, so the cell membrane is mostly made up of lipids and proteins. Okay, and this structure, this lipid bilayer that we're going to look at in just a moment, provides many vital functions. Again, we've touched on a few of those. This cell membrane functions to regulate the passage of materials, right, into and out of the cell. That's one major function. The cell membrane serves as a surface for chemical reactions to take place. It serves as a way for cells to adhere to other cells, right? We looked at, you know, those levels of organization, and we said different cells interact together to form tissue, right? So we need this cell-to-cell adhesion to happen. We need interaction and connections between adjacent cells, okay? And so the cell membrane and its components facilitates this adherence between cells, cell-cell contact. And then lastly, the plasma membrane serves as a means for signal transduction, okay, for cells to communicate with its environment. Okay, there's a lot of signaling and signal transductions and transferring of signals between the internal cell and the external compartments. And so that's really important, and the cell membrane serves as an intermediate for that to happen, transmitting signals. Okay, so these are all very vital functions of the plasma membrane. All right, let's look a little bit more at the structure. Okay, when we talk about the plasma membrane, we refer to this structure as a phospholipid bilayer. Write that term down. Phospholipid bilayer. Okay, I'm going to break this word phospholipid bilayer down. If you didn't know anything about this structure, you should be able to get a little idea just based on that word. So phospholipid is a specific type of lipid, right? We're clear that the lipids are one of our classes of biological molecules that, you know, has very known characteristics of being hydrophobic, and it's typically, you know, made of the oil. It contains oils, fats, waxes. These lipids are sort of this hydrophobic barrier. All right, and then this term bilayer is referring to two layers, right? The prefix bi means two. So this cell membrane, even though we often see it in kind of that 1D structure where we might just draw our line on the board and say this is our cell, well, that thin line, if you looked at it from a three-dimensional standpoint, it's two layers of lipids interacting together, forming that barrier. And so the cell membrane consists of a fluid bilayer of phospholipid molecules. So we have two layers of lipids that are forming this continuous barrier around the cell. Okay, this phospholipid molecule, write down the term phospholipid. Okay, you need to be able to describe to me properties of a phospholipid. One property is that it's an amphipathic molecule. Okay, An amphipathic molecule is a very unique molecule that has both hydrophobic and hydrophilic components in this molecule. Okay, so if we look at this structure right here, this is a phospholipid. This single molecule right here is a phospholipid. Okay, it has a head region and a tail region, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail in just a second. But collectively, we have two layers of phospholipids here that makes up that cell membrane, that phospholipid bilayer that we're talking about. And you can see how these lipids are arranged where we have the heads pointing to the extracellular environment, and then we also have the head pointing to this intracellular environment. And so if we looked at this cell in the 3D observation, we see that this lipid bilayer right here is two layers of lipids, where we have the internal compartment, which is an aqueous environment, water, right? And then we have the external environment. Okay, the outside of the cell is also surrounded by an aqueous environment. Okay, and so structurally, this amphipathic molecule has the two regions that I just mentioned. The formation of this barrier, this bilayer, okay, it's two layers of lipids. Okay, a phospholipid molecule, write this down, has two parts. It has a head and it has a tail. This is a single phospholipid. Okay, we said that the phospholipid is an amphipathic molecule, which means it has a hydrophobic region and a hydrophilic region. So the hydrophobic region of the phospholipid is the, the hydrophilic region of the phospholipid is the head. Okay, this head region is going to be the region that's hydrophilic, so it's going to be in contact with water. Okay, we see our bilayer structure here in a 3D observation. Okay, these heads are going to be hydrophilic, and they're going to come in contact with the water in the extracellular environment as well as inside of the cell. So we have the hydrophilic head and we have the hydrophobic tails. Okay, these hydrophobic tails interact together to form that bilayer structure. All right, that's what's going to create our barrier. Okay, that semi-permeable or selectively permeable barrier. Okay, we'll come back to that term in just a second. But right now we're just looking at the structure. Again, we refer to the structure of the cell membrane as a phospholipid bilayer, right? And this phospholipid bilayer is created by the joining or interactions between many phospholipid molecules that are basically going to align themselves in two layers, right? And we have the hydrophilic heads interacting with water outside of the cell and inside of the cell. And then we have our hydrophobic tails in the middle. So go ahead and make a note of that. Okay, that the heads are on the external parts, and then the tails are hydrophobic regions in the middle. Okay, those hydrophobic tails are going to account for this selectively permeable barrier that's made by this dynamic structure. What questions do we have about this so far? Any questions?
No.
Please mute your mics. Okay. So we said that the cell membrane is made up mostly of proteins and lipids. All right, we're clear that the lipid component are those phospholipids. Okay, those are the types of lipids that make up the cell membrane. Let's look at some of the proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. All right, so structurally, again, we're describing the structure as a phospholipid bilayers that has proteins embedded. Okay, these membrane proteins are very important when we start to consider cellular activities and processes. Okay, these proteins that we find embedded in the cell membrane has some very important jobs in transport. Okay, remember we talked about proteins in our last section. We talked about biological molecules and that some of the jobs of proteins were functioning in transport. Okay, so transporting materials, one of the very important roles of proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. Transmitting information. So I talked about a little bit of signal transduction. Okay, that signal transduction takes place by way of, you know, those signal transduction proteins in the cell membrane that interacts with certain ligands or other substances to send signals throughout the cell. So communication. Other jobs of these membrane proteins is to connect cells to other cells. All right, so we talked about, again, that whole tissue formation. All right, cell-to-cell adhesion, cell-to-cell interaction is very critical. Okay, so jot down some of these. Okay, and I would like for you to be able to describe, you know, again, in your own words, the structure of this cell membrane. Okay, what is the structure? It's a fluid. It's sort of a dynamic a bilayer that functions to regulate what's going to be able to come in and out of the cell. Okay, so we're understanding that though this looks like a static structure, is not. It's basically a fluid structure where there's these phospholipids that are constantly sort of in motion, if you will, and they're going to allow for the passage of certain substances by way with the use of energy or without the use of energy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next lesson. We'll talk about some ways that substances can cross the membrane by way of, you know, pores or channels. Okay, those proteins that can actually transport substances into the cell, but other substances, non-polar substances like gases, and they can diffuse across that membrane very easily. Okay, water, though, is not non-polar. Water is polar. It can also diffuse pretty easily across the cell. All right, but let me not get ahead of myself. All right, so structure, phospholipid bilayer. We understand that this phospholipid molecule is very unique. It's an amphipathic molecule. It's got the hydrophilic head. It's got a hydrophobic tail. Those phospholipids arrange themselves in that sort of, in that two sheets or two layers of phospholipids to create that bilayer structure. So then we're saying we have proteins embedded in that membrane. Okay, these proteins are very important. They have various jobs that are vital to the cell. For example, again, transporting materials across the cell, transmitting information, connecting cells to other cells. Okay, let's talk about two important classes of membrane proteins. Okay, write these down. Two major classes of membrane proteins, and these classes are defined by how tightly they associate with that lipid bilayer. Okay, so we have one class of proteins that are going to be loosely associated or kind of, you know, not embedded, but they're nearby, attached to the cell membrane. And then we have another class of proteins that are going to be basically embedded tightly into the cell membrane, to where if we try to remove those proteins, you're gonna disrupt the integrity of that cell membrane. So write this down in your notes. We have two classes of membrane proteins. We have integral proteins, integral membrane proteins, write these down. Integral membrane proteins and peripheral membrane proteins. Okay, and again, if we just look at these terms, they tell us a little something about how these proteins function. So integral, okay, what does the word integral mean to you? If I say something is integral, what does that mean?
Like all inclusive.
All inclusive, okay. What else? What else comes to mind when you hear integral? Anyone?
Inside of something, like inside of
it. Yeah, when I hear integral, I think important. Okay, if I say something is integral, that means it's important. All right, integral membrane proteins, and that if it's integral, if you don't have it, then there's going to be a problem, or if it malfunctions or so forth. So integral membrane proteins are those proteins that are firmly bound to the membrane. Okay, they are firmly attached. Okay, they're going to extend throughout that membrane. So if my finger here represents, our phospholipid bilayer, integral proteins are going to span throughout the length of that phospholipid bilayer. Okay, and they are important. Okay, they are an important piece of the puzzle here, so much so that if we try to remove an integral protein from the membrane, you're going to disrupt the structure and integrity of that bilayer, and that's not a good thing. Okay, we want our lipid bilayer to be a very firm and intact structure. Okay, so we have our integral proteins that are going to be firmly bound to the membrane. They can extend into and out of the cell. If you look at this image that I have here, this blue structure represents an integral protein, and we can see that it spans the entire length or width of our plasma membrane. Okay, so you should be able to readily identify an integral protein as compared to a peripheral. Okay, peripheral. Okay, when you think peripheral, these membrane proteins are not going to be embedded in the lipid bilayer, but they're going to be located on the inner or outer surface of the membrane. So this structure right here down below, this is a peripheral protein. It's also important. It has some very important jobs, but it's not embedded. Okay, it doesn't span the width of our membrane, but it's closely attached on the inner or outer surface of the membrane. Okay, so you should be able to compare and contrast integral and peripheral membrane proteins. Okay, where they are structurally and what happens. What are they there for? So one type of integral protein is a transmembrane protein. And again, this transmembrane protein just tells us that it can span the width of our membrane. Ouch. What questions do we have about that? All right, so this is a pretty good model of the phospholipid bilayer right here. So I will have you, well, you have an exercise that you're going to go and actually build a phospholipid bilayer in just a second and take a closer look at this structure. But this is a great model representation of the phospholipid bilayer. So when I post these slides, do come back and look at it. All right, we have our phospholipid bilayer here represented by these red phospholipids where we have that hydrophilic head and these hydrophobic tails in the middle. And then we have different types of proteins throughout this phospholipid bilayer. Okay. All right, so what are some functions of the membrane proteins? We talked a little bit about adhering, so they can function for anchoring, all right, anchoring cells to other substrates. We talked about transport. We talked about enzymatic activity a little bit last unit. We talked about enzymes a little bit and how important enzymes are for cellular activity. Okay, enzymes function to catalyze chemical reactions, okay? And so some of those proteins that are embedded in that cell membrane can have enzymatic activity. They can function as enzymes. Okay, so they can. So again, here we have some more functions of proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. Okay, they can function as transporters. Okay, this green schematic right here represents the transport of materials into the cell through this opening. Okay, so it functions as an opening or a channel or a pore for substances to cross into the cell membrane, cross into the cell. These proteins can function as receptors. Okay, write this down. These receptors are important in signal transduction. So it's receptor for these ligands, other substances that come in and basically initiate the transduction of signals, communications into the cell. Enzymes are responsible for catalyzing reactions in biological systems. Okay, so we talked about chemical reactions a little bit already, how we start with certain elements or reactants and we create new products. All right, enzymes facilitate that process. Okay, enzymes facilitate chemical reactions by speeding them up. They are biological catalysts, and we do have another unit on enzymes. But in your notes right now, I think it's a great time to understand, the role of enzymes, how they function as biological catalysts to speed up chemical reactions. All right. We talked about energy, right? In our first chapter, how energy is a requirement for life. We need energy to fuel these reactions and processes that take place. Okay. Metabolic activity, and so forth. Enzymes are going to influence the amount of energy that's required for those reactions to take place. Okay. Enzymes function by lowering the activation energy of a chemical reaction. We'll get to that. Let me not go off topic too much. Okay, so again, we're still here just looking at some other membrane protein functions. Anchoring proteins. These proteins help to anchor or adhere cells to various substrates and to create that extracellular matrix. Okay, so here is just another schematic of some major functions of membrane proteins that we just talked about: cell recognition, transport, enzymatic activity, signal transduction. Okay, attachment to the extracellular matrix. I want to stop right here today as I introduce this first component. And there's 2 exercises that you're going to do today. If you go over to Blackboard in your content section, there's a URL link for this interactive experience for you to construct a phospholipid bilayer, construct a membrane, a plasma membrane, and all of its components, so that you can kind of put your hands on it a little bit and break it down. And then you have a written assignment. Stop this. Stop.